Hello friends, this is Maria Jose Hamel, and this is Health for Today. In today's video, I'm going to talk about why it's recommended and beneficial to eat like an Adventist. And the title for this presentation actually came from a story that came out a few years ago on the Today Show that actually said, eat like an Adventist. 8 foods for a longer, healthier life. And I was just so intrigued by that title. I thought it was a great title, and in fact I used it for a website, Eat Like an Adventist. I haven't been updating it a lot, but I did use it for that and for a Facebook page. And of course, this whole concept of the Adventist people having a longevity advantage came from the original article that came out in National Geographic back in the year 2005 that started it all. It was called Secrets of Living Longer, and it featured 5 places in the world that are now known as the blue zones, where people live longer, but not just longer, better. So they're healthier, they're doing things until their old age. They're not just sick in a nursing home or in a wheelchair or something. They're people who are active until their very old age, sometimes past 100 years of age. And so this blue zone started a whole movement of healthy living and living longer but better. And of course, one of those blue zones, in fact, the only blue zone in North America, is found in Loma Linda, California. And the reason why Loma Linda, California is maybe different from other places in California or the United States for that matter, is because Loma Linda has a high concentration of Seventh-day Adventist church members who happen to be a little bit more, even more health sort of oriented than other maybe Adventists, because in Loma Linda, California, there's also a medical school and a university, Loma Linda University, and there's also a big medical center. So there's more of an emphasis on health in Loma Linda than maybe other places where there's a lot of Adventists. And so it just so happens that Loma Linda is a place where there's a lot of Adventists who live to be 100 or more years old and are in excellent health. And what is it about Loma Linda that makes it different from other places in North America? And of course, there's other blue zones. There's Nicoya in Costa Rica. There's Sardinia, which is an island off the coast of Italy. There's Icaria in Greece, and there's Okinawa, Japan. And I wanted to show you a little bit of what makes these places, these blue zones, a little different in regards to their diet. So all of this information that I'm going to show you now comes from the Blue Zones organization, because after the 2005 article in National Geographic, the author of that article wrote a book called The Blue Zones, and that became a bestseller. And after that, he wrote another book talking about places where he wanted to implement the same kind of things he found out that the Blue Zones lifestyle was composed of. So he wanted to take those pieces to other communities around the United States and other parts, so that other communities can become blue zones as well. So anyway, they become a larger organization, and now that's what they're trying to do, promote longevity in other places. But I just wanted to show you a comparison of the different blue zones as far as what their diet is and where their calories mainly come from. So let's take a look at Loma Linda, California, and how the centenarians in Loma Linda ate most of their lives, because we're not just going to look at what people eat today. That might be different from what people ate 50 years ago, and what people ate 50 years ago might have been a determinant factor for them living to be 100 today. So this is what the centenarians ate most of their lives. As you can see in this pie chart, a very large percentage of the diet from Loma Linda, California residents that today are centenarians came from vegetables. This is the one blue zone that really has the highest percentage of vegetable intake. 33% of their diet. 27% fruit. And so that right there makes Loma Linda maybe one of the healthiest places in the world just because of the high intake of fruits and vegetables. There's also a very good amount of legumes and soy being consumed. Now, most Loma Linda, California centenarians eat very little meat. In fact, you could see right there 4% meat and poultry, really 1% egg, 1% fish, but they are ovo-lacto vegetarians, so they do consume some dairy, although it's only about 10% of the diet. But it's interesting to note that between all 5 blue zones, Loma Linda has one of the highest life expectancies, and it's one of the ones that has low dairy, because some other ones have higher and other ones have lower, and I'll show you that too. But it's only about 10%. Of course, there's a good bit of whole grains, nuts and seeds. It's a small amount. Very small percentage of added sugar. So that's only about 1%. And added fats only about 2%. So I just wanted to point out the large amount of vegetables and fruits in the centenarian diet from Loma Linda, California. Let's go to see another blue zone. This one is Sardinia in Italy, and how they ate most of their lives. And you can see a different breakdown there from the different sources of calories. It is a much larger percentage from dairy and primarily from sheep and goat's milk. So it's not industrialized milk from cows that live in concentrated industrial farms. It's very different. It's much maybe healthier in that sense. Maybe also much more organic, not as many chemicals, hormones, and all these other things. But interesting to note that their largest source of calories is whole grains. And in this particular place, the whole grains they ate was barley, mostly barley. But as you can see, there's about 12% vegetables. The meat and fish and poultry is also very low. It's only about 5% of their diet comes from meat. Legumes is 4%. It's a little bit more of the sugar, about 3%, but still very low. Added fats, about 2%. And as you can see, I don't see any eggs here, but there is dairy, 26% of the diet, primarily coming from sheep and goat's milk. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go see the next blue zone. This is the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica. And again, we see a different breakdown. We see only about 26% whole grains in comparison with Sardinia, which was over 40%. Also about a quarter of their diet coming from dairy. It doesn't specify which sources, but it does say that most of the whole grains consumed in Nicoya Peninsula are from corn. 14% vegetables. They do have a highest amount of sugar coming into their diet, about 11%. 9% fruits, 7% legumes. But again, we see another commonality with the last two, which is only about 5% of their diet comes from flesh products, meat products, such as fish, poultry, and red meat. Only, again, about 2% added fats. It's relatively low in added fats. Only about 2% eggs. So again, one of the salient points here are the large amount of whole grains. And as you can see, just like with the other blue zones, there's not a lot of processed foods. The only thing that makes it a little bit different in this case is the 11% added sugars. And again, there's some blue zones that live longer and some that were actually had a even higher life expectancy than the whole group. And those were the Adventist and the Okinawans. So Costa Rica wasn't in the highest place, maybe because they ate more sugar and more dairy. Icaria in Greece, here's the other one, and this is our fourth one. And we see 20% vegetables, other vegetables, because 17% of their diet came from greens alone. So a large percent of green vegetables and 20% other vegetables. So that together is 37% of their diet. So that kind of compares with the Adventists in that they consume a lot of vegetables. Fruits is about 16%, legumes quite high at 11%, 9% potatoes. So I would think most of their starches came from potatoes. They do consume more olive oil and fish than the other blue zones. Pasta about 5%, meat about 5%, sweets about 4%, and 1% grain. So that's interesting because most of their starches don't come from whole grains like the other ones we saw, but mostly from potatoes and vegetables. So that's in Icaria, Greece, and we see sweets again 4%. That's not a super high in comparison with the standard American diet, but they do consume a little bit of olive oil, not too high, but more than the other blue zones we saw. And the last one is Okinawa, Japan. And really the most impressive thing about this pie chart is that 67% of their calorie intake came from sweet potatoes. That's it, sweet potatoes. So they ate a lot of sweet potatoes. Of course, Okinawa, Japan. Most people that are centenarians today lived through World War II. And during World War II, Okinawa was occupied, and a lot of these people had to actually flee to the mountains, and that's why they had to eat nothing but sweet potatoes for a long time. It really was the only thing that they were able to consume. But apparently this was a lifelong love for sweet potatoes, so they kept eating them. Wanted to just notice there's also 12% rice, so being from Japan, that's pretty common. 9% vegetables, 6% legumes, other grains about 3%. Fish, meat, and poultry, very small amount, only about 2%, and other foods 1%. So we don't see any eggs, really no dairy. Very small amount of meat, only about 2%. So this is really the closest thing to a vegan diet that you can see in Okinawa, Japan, and they do have the longest life expectancy in the world, really. Very closely followed by Loma Linda. So in some aspects, Loma Linda is pretty close, although Okinawa, Japan has the highest life expectancy in the world. So putting all this information together, I think we could see that there's a common thread here, and it's the following. All of these places, you see very, very low percentage of meat consumption. Even though none of them are 100% vegan, most of them only consume meat at a very low percentage, in some cases only in special occasions. Like festivals or birthdays or things like that, just special occasions. Most of their daily diet is either vegetarian or vegan. And there's a lot of fruit and vegetable and whole grains and just unprocessed food consumption, and some of them eat some sugar but still not a lot. So the Blue Zones people put together a chart with a recommendation based on what they have observed, and it's the following. It's another pie chart, I guess you could say. And it's basically food guidelines where they tell us what they think would be ideal just by observation of what the Blue Zones ate. And this is a 95% plant-based diet with only 5% animal-based products. 65% of the calories come from carbohydrates, which is quite a difference from what sometimes we hear in the popular media about diets for weight loss, which are sometimes very low in carbohydrates, low in breads or low in grains, and high maybe in proteins and fats, mostly from animal sources. But the longevity data shows us a very different picture. 65% carbohydrate diet is actually considered a very high carb diet, but yet it produced the longest living people in the world. So that's something that we need to consider and remember maybe. Also 20% fats, which is quite low actually compared with the standard American diet, which is in the high 30s up to 40% fat. And it's of course a very high fat diet. So even 30% fat sometimes is considered low fat when they do studies and consider low fat diet, and then they don't find any, benefits. It's because low fat sometimes is defined as like 30% fat, which is, I think, as a nutritionist, still very high fat. But anyway, 20% fat is what they recommend, and 15% proteins. And they're not saying 15% meat protein, they're saying 15% protein, and some of it comes from legumes, as we have seen in the pie charts from the different Blue Zones. Legumes are a great source of vegetable protein, as well as nuts and seeds. And of course, they do have a little picture of a fish and a little bit of a picture of meat, because again, none of these Blue Zones were really vegan. We've never really observed a population that's 100% vegan. But the question remains, what would be the health impact of a whole population adopting a whole food plant-based diet that is even 98 or 100% based on plants of, whole plants? And we could probably see maybe even better results. Of course, the reason why this has never happened, in my opinion, is because we never had access to such an abundant array of foods like we do today. Because for most of human history, humans had to basically survive and find enough food to eat. And in some places in the world, eating 100% plant-based just wasn't possible. So now in the 20th, starting in the 20th and now in the 21st century, we have an unprecedented access to foods all year long. And so I think now we would be able to achieve that 100% plant-based if we wanted to. But that's besides the point. So I just wanted to show you what getting closer to ideal would be. But is it just the diet that makes Seventh-day Adventists the longest living population in North America? There certainly are other lifestyle choices that Adventists make that have quite a big impact on their life expectancy. So here are some other things in this chart that show us more or less what other things might be helpful in accomplishing that longer lifespan. For instance, abstaining from tobacco and alcohol are probably the most important. And I'll talk about that a little bit when I talk about the Adventist health studies and what they have found. But certainly abstaining from tobacco and alcohol have had great impact in the life expectancies of Adventists, especially Loma Linda residents. Other things they do, as you could see, aside from the diet. So the diet is on the left side of the chart here. Consume generous amounts of fruits and vegetables like we saw in the pie chart. Whole grains. Things that they consume moderately are low-fat dairy, legumes, and nuts. Things that they consume sparingly are saturated fats, cholesterol, sugar, and salt. What I'm saying here is that not everybody who's Adventist actually follows this, but it's the observation of centenarian Adventists. So, and nobody is also forced to follow this. This is absolutely a personal choice. But what we can observe is then there's actually a benefit from it. And things that they abstain from: meat, tobacco, and again, not everybody. In fact, people have been abstaining less and less from meat as years have gone by, unfortunately. But they are encouraged to abstain from meat, tobacco, and alcohol for sure, and caffeine, although again, not everybody does follow that, but that's a recommendation. But here are other lifestyle choices that Adventists generally make that could also, the Blue Zone people especially, have found that could probably have also an impact on their lifespan. And they reserve one day for rest and worship, which is Saturday. And that day is usually spent in communion with God and family. In a way, I think the important thing is also to remember that the Sabbath day is a day to be away from the stresses of daily life. It gives you a break from the daily stress. And that probably has quite a bit of benefit in regards to people's mental health and stress level. So I think that's important, and even the Blue Zones people recognize that's very important probably. Another thing that the Adventist community emphasizes is to get regular exercise, fresh air, and sunshine. And we have seen plenty of scientific evidence that these practices are very healthy. I mean, the fresh air for sure. Sunshine provides the vitamin D that has been associated with so many health benefits, and being low on vitamin D has been associated with many diseases. And of course, exercise, no need to really say a lot about that, because we know exercise and regular physical activity is part of any healthy life. Our bodies were meant to move, and there's plenty of scientific research on that as well. The last point of the Adventist lifestyle is stay focused on God. So that, again, that aspect of faith, hope, which helps so much in avoiding maybe despair and lack of hope. And family and community. So that social support has always been very, very important in the Adventist lifestyle. I want to now talk a little bit about one of the reasons why the Adventist community has become, I guess, such a important part of the lifestyle medicine movement. So anybody who's read any of the books on maybe whole food plant-based diet lifestyle or just lifestyle medicine, if you're in the healthcare field, for instance, and you're a member of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, you would have noticed that Adventists that are mentioned just about in almost every presentation. What has made Adventists so famous in this community? Well, way back in the 1960s, in fact, they started recruiting people in the late 50s. They started this thing called the Adventist Health Studies, different epidemiological studies that were conducted starting back in the late 50s and all throughout the 60s and 70s. And these are studies that were actually done in Loma Linda by researchers to try to figure out, first of all, to try to figure out if there was an advantage for living a healthy lifestyle like this, because this was not known back in the late 50s and early 60s. So the first Adventist study that was conducted was actually now called the Adventist Mortality Study. And what they did is that they recruited thousands of people and they compared, and they basically gave these thousands of Adventists the same questionnaire that was being given by the American Cancer Society to a much larger group of individuals, because they were conducting a concurrent study to try to find out more about cancer and why it happened and the different lifestyles associated with that and the mortality from different cancers. So at the same time as the American Cancer Society was conducting their study, the Adventist mortality study was being carried on, and they gave basically the Adventists the same questionnaire, so as to compare Adventist and non-Adventist and their cancer incidence. And they found a lot of very interesting information. First of all, Adventist men lived 6.2 years longer than non-Adventist men, which were matched, again, were matched for education levels and other things, so we're trying to find similar groups to compare. And Adventist women had 3.7-year advantage on their counterparts. Other things that were important in regards to cancer is that death rate from all cancers were lower in Adventist men and Adventist women. Adventist men in particular, 40% lower and 24% lower in Adventist women. Of course, lung cancer was the big one, because since the Adventists don't smoke, they had much lower rate of lung cancer, 79% lower. But also colorectal cancer was very significantly lower, about 38% lower. Breast cancer was 15% lower. Coronary heart disease was 34% lower for Adventist men and 2% lower for Adventist women. You see the difference there between men and women, because men tend to smoke more, drink more, and do things that actually affect their heart health. So it was a bigger advantage for Adventist men by not smoking or drinking. So these are some of the things that were found in the Adventist mortality study, doing a comparison with Adventists and non-Adventists. Of course, this sparked more interest in what is it that makes Adventists actually live longer. But that was at least the initial finding, that Adventists for sure do live longer and have less cancer rates. So then, more money was obtained to continue doing studies. And then in 1974, more or less, there was another study that was initiated, also in Loma Linda. And this was known as Adventist Health Study 1. And more or less lasted from 1974 to 1988. 34,000 Adventists took part of this study. And it basically was designed to find out which components in particular from the Adventist lifestyle gave protection against disease. So we had already found from the first one that there was protection against disease, but which aspects of lifestyle actually did that? And they found with this study that Adventist men live an average of 7.3 years longer than other California men. And Adventist women live 4.4 years longer than other California women. But there's a select group of Adventists that actually did participate in 5 simple health behaviors that Seventh-day Adventists church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, has been promoting for over 100 years. Not everybody, again, does this because it is personal and it is, optional. But the ones who do had an advantage. And these are the 5 simple behaviors. Not smoking, that's not, not necessarily something super optional in the church. It's really, really not encouraged. But if they didn't smoke, if they ate a plant-based diet, if they ate nuts several times per week, and they did engage in regular exercise, and last one, if they maintained a normal body weight, so again, if they avoided being overweight or obese, that allowed them to increase their lifespan for up to 10 years for men and 6 years for women. So the longevity advantage from doing those behaviors was quite significant. Also, they found in this Adventist Health Study 1 that reducing the consumption of red and white meat was associated with a decrease in colon cancer, and eating legumes was protective against colon cancer. Other things they found in this study was that eating nuts, again, several times a week, not only increases longevity, but also reduces the risk of heart attack by up to 50%. Eating whole grain bread instead of white bread reduced non-fatal heart attack risk by 45%. Drinking 5 or more glasses of water a day may reduce heart disease by 50%. And men who had a high consumption of tomatoes reduced the risk of prostate cancer by 40%. Lastly, drinking soy milk more than once daily may reduce prostate cancer by up to 70%. So these are some of the things that some of the components of the Adventist lifestyle, especially down in Loma Linda, that made a difference as far as why they lived longer, why they had less cancer. But it didn't end there. There was yet another health study done in the 2000s. It was started in 2002, in fact, and they actually enrolled 96,000 participants in that one, and I think more were added on later. Not everybody follows through with all the questionnaires that they need to be doing, but more or less 90-some thousand people are enrolled in this study, and they found even more things. Now, the emphasis of this study was to make a comparison, not so much of Adventists and non-Adventists like before, but now the comparison was going to be between Adventists that have different lifestyles, because that way you can get rid of the confounder. So by comparing Adventists and non-Adventists, one can just say, well, they do not smoke, they do not drink. That's probably what makes a difference. But when you only study Adventists, then you get rid of that difference, because all of them, participate in lifestyle behaviors that don't include alcohol or cigarettes. So the only differences there are mainly nutritional in their diet. So that actually made Adventists a really good population to study. And what they found here when they compared basically Adventists with different lifestyles and different diets is they found that vegetarians and vegans in particular had a marked difference in the prevalence of metabolic risk factors such as triglyceride levels, glucose levels, blood pressure levels, waist circumference, and BMI. And a vegetarian dietary pattern was associated with a 56% less risk of metabolic syndrome. Now we know metabolic syndrome is very high risk factor for heart attack and heart disease, and that's the #1 cause of death in the United States. Of course, the vegetarian and vegans had lower BMI, lower diabetes, and lower blood pressure, and I'll show you a chart that illustrates that in a really visual manner. Certain foods in particular, this is again some of the preliminary data. This study is still ongoing. There are certain foods that were found to lower the risk of colorectal polyps and colon cancer, such as brown rice, cooked greens, dried fruits, and legumes. And I just wanted to show you a very good table that shows this comparison between different Adventist groups in a very visual way. It basically is showing non-vegetarians, semi-vegetarians eat meat, but only about once a week or so. Pesco-vegetarians only eat fish, so no red meat or poultry. Lacto-ovo-vegetarians don't eat any flesh meat at all. They only consume eggs and dairy. And again, vegans who basically abstain from all animal products altogether. And as you can see the differences in their BMI, their diabetes risk, and the hypertension, you can see a stepwise decrease in the risk. First of all, let's look at BMI. The only group that fell under what's considered normal BMI, which is below 24.9, were the vegans. Everybody else was above the normal BMI, so they all fell in the overweight category as an average. And of course, you see a stepwise increase in the BMI as you add more foods from animal sources into the diet. And the highest BMI was the non-vegetarians. But then, if we consider the diabetes and the hypertension, if we take the non-vegetarian group as a reference, we see then there's a stepwise decrease in risk for diabetes, going down semi-vegetarian, pesco-vegetarian, lacto-ovo-vegetarian, and finally vegan, only having about 22% of the risk that the non-vegetarians had. Therefore, there was a 78% decrease in risk for diabetes when people follow a vegan lifestyle. Same thing with hypertension. If you take the reference as the non-vegetarians, then you start to see a decrease in the risk as you consume less and less animal products. So the semi-vegetarians had, certainly an advantage, 23% reduction. Pesco-vegetarians of 38% reduction. Lacto-ovo-vegetarians had a 55% reduction. And finally, the vegan group had a 75% reduction in their risk for hypertension. And of course, these are risk factors for heart disease, cancer, and diabetes, or of course diabetes and all these other diseases. So just to kind of figure out why is it Adventists are any different than other religious groups in the United States? Why do so many Adventists eat a whole food plant-based diet or a plant-based diet? Why are Adventists any different than other religious groups? That's kind of my question. Well, first of all, the one maybe most important reason why Adventists do follow a plant-based diet is because they really take seriously this verse from Genesis 1:29. And of course, Genesis chapter 1 tells us the story of creation. And in that verse, God is basically telling Adam and Eve what they are going to be eating while living in the Garden of Eden. And he says, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you." So, I mean, you can't get any more clear than the word plant says every plant yielding seed. So what can be more plant-based than plant? So that's one of the reasons why Adventists follow a plant-based diet. We really think that the human body was created to consume a plant-based diet. Humans were later given the option, maybe, or permission, I guess you could say, by God to consume animal products. But it was for survival reasons, especially because after the flood, we see that Noah comes out of the ark. There's basically a destroyed world, and they're probably running out of food as they were in the ark for months and months and months, and here they come out and the world is just destroyed. And so God gives them the permission, I guess, to consume animal foods because they had to survive. And after the earth was changed by the flood in a very radical way, there were some parts that were going to be deserts, mountains, Arctic regions, basically lots of parts in the world where people were not going to be able to sustain themselves only consuming plant foods. But that was not the case at first. In the Garden of Eden, there's plenty of plants to consume, and that's all human needed, and that's what the human body was created for. The second reason why Adventists tend to live a whole food plant-based lifestyle, or at least appreciate it and encourage it, is because of the writings of one of the main pioneers of the church, and her name is Ellen White. And she, by the way, was featured in the Smithsonian magazine as one of the 100 most significant Americans of all time. She is the most translated female writer in the entire history of literature. And she's the most translated American author of either gender. And I'm just going to give you a few quotes that support a whole food plant-based diet, a vegan diet even, before a vegan diet was a thing and nobody had ever heard of the term whole food plant-based. So these were written in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And just to kind of show you how these writings were way ahead of their time. In 1905, in the Ministry of Healing, a book called The Ministry of Healing, Ellen White said the following: grains, fruits, nuts, and vegetables constitute the diet chosen for us by our Creator. These foods, prepared in as simple and natural a manner as possible, are the most healthful and nourishing. They impart a strength, a power of endurance, and a vigor of intellect that are not afforded by a more complex and stimulating diet. This was written in 1905. And yet, until very recently, people were saying, oh, you need, flesh foods or meat or animal proteins to be strong. And of course, Adventists have been saying, no, for a long time, but people didn't really believe it. Until very recently, when there has been a lot of studies that actually confirmed it. And then there was this whole new documentary called The Game Changers, where this was actually proven basically beyond any doubt. Okay, here's another one. It is a mistake to suppose that muscular strength depends on the use of animals. The needs of the system can be better supplied and more vigorous health can be enjoyed without its use. Here again, another quote that says you don't need to consume animal proteins to have big muscles. You can have actually a lot of strength with plant foods. Here's another one. This was written in 1903. The eating of flesh is unnatural. We are to return to God's original purpose in the creation of man. And this belief actually is very unique to Seventh-day Adventist churches. No other denomination that I know about, or maybe smaller groups here or there, might believe this, but of the major denominations, I really don't know of any that actually believe that we need to go back to God's original intent in creation. Here's another one written in 1897. Shall human beings live on the flesh of dead animals? The answer from the light that God has given is no. Decidedly no. Physicians who claim to understand the human organism ought not to encourage their patients to subsist on the flesh of dead animals. They should point out the increase of disease in the animal kingdom. And so this was written way back in 1897, and not until very recently, maybe about 9 or 10 years ago, was the American College of Lifestyle Medicine created, with physicians who finally agreed with this statement that physicians should really not encourage their patients to subsist on the flesh of dead animals, and they should point out the increase of disease in the animal kingdom, which, to be honest, when this was written, it wasn't that big of a problem. Maybe regionally, but not systemically like we see it now, with animals where animals are kept in these concentrated animal feeding operations called CAFOs. And the diseases that these animals contract is just overwhelming. In fact, 70 to 80% of antibiotics that are made in the United States go to animals instead of humans because of the amount of diseases that these poor animals have to suffer because of the conditions they live in. This was not the case back in 1897. So this one thing also was way ahead of its time, in my opinion anyway. Here's another one. Think of the cruelty to animals that meat eating involves, and its effect on those who inflict and those who behold it. How it destroys the tenderness with which we should regard these creatures of God. This was written in 1905, before the term ethical veganism existed, and nobody ever thought of this concept. I mean, maybe there's people who cared about cruelty to animals, but it wasn't nearly as a movement as it is today. So I think here's another example that's writing ahead of its time. Here's a few more. The effects of cheese is deleterious. Back in 1890. Back in 1868, fine flour, which means white refined flour, or fine flour bread does not impart to the system the nourishment that is to be found in unbolted wheat bread. So here's a comparison of white bread with whole grain bread. Up until very recently, most people ate just Wonder Bread, and not a lot of people ate whole wheat bread. It wasn't a thing. Now it's, of course, more and more a popular thing to do, but very recently has the science research caught up with this concept of eating more whole grains. Here's another one. Let the people be taught how to prepare food without the use of milk or butter. Tell them that the time will soon come when there will be no safety in using eggs, milk, cream, or butter, because disease in animals is increasing in proportion to the increase of wickedness among men. Now let me clarify that Ellen White was not a vegan, and she probably used milk and eggs and other things, cream. But she did write that there will come soon a time where the use of those things would not be safe. And it's almost like she's predicting that there will be a time where people would need to be vegan. And of course, I think that time is now, since not only do we have these industrialized operations where animals are sick, but also because now we realize more and more the effect of these foods on the human system, and we have the science to back it up. But also because now in the 21st century, starting in the 20th century really, we have more access to food than ever before in the history of humanity. So humans all throughout history had to basically survive, try to find enough food to survive. But now we have abundance of food all year long that really didn't exist until maybe the last 100 years or so. So there's never been a better time to really consume a whole food plant-based diet than now, probably. Here's some more interesting quotes that don't have so much to do with diet or the composition of the diet, but more the timing of meals. It says, for persons of sedentary habits, late suppers are particularly harmful. That's 1905. Make breakfast correspond more nearly to the heartiest meal of the day. 1884. In most cases, 2 meals a day are preferable to 3. So this was in late 1800s, early 1900s, and it almost seems to point to something that now we know more about. Now there's this thing called intermittent fasting that only in the last couple of years people are really started to get into, and really the research has been more and more abundant on this topic. And there's different types of intermittent fasting you can do. You can eat very few calories a couple of days of the week and eat normal the rest, or eat later more towards the night and fast in the morning. But there's a type of intermittent fasting called early time restricted feeding. And this is the one type of intermittent fasting that actually has been found to harmonize better with our circadian rhythm in a whole new field in science called chronobiology. And that means eating earlier in the day, making breakfast hopefully the biggest meal of the day, avoiding late suppers. And of course, 2 meals a day works perfect for this. So it's almost as if she was writing something way ahead of her time again that didn't really begin to really take hold until the last, I would say, 5 years or so. And here's the last one I want to leave you with. Ministry of Healing, page 127, written 1905. Pure air, sunlight, abstemiousness, which means to abstain from harmful substances such as tobacco, alcohol, drugs, rest, exercise, proper diet, the use of water, trust in divine power. These are the true remedies. And to be honest, for myself, I always thought of these 8 laws of health or 8 principles of health, 8 true remedies, as very good and in fact crucial for avoiding the main killer diseases such as heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and so on, and all these other chronic diseases. But just in the last couple of months, because of this pandemic we're living under, I have come to realize the importance of these 8 true remedies for avoiding infectious diseases. And in fact, I did a whole video on it. You should probably watch it if you're interested, on the 8 steps to strengthen your immune system. And to be honest, when I was doing the research for that, I was not looking to align them with this quote and the 8 principles of health. I started off by looking for things to help the immune system and only kept the things that there was enough scientific evidence, and I ended up with 7 steps. And I realized, wow, these 7 steps are almost the same ones of, the 8 principles of health. I'm just missing one, and it was air. So I started looking for the benefits of fresh air for the immune system. Sure enough, there was plenty of evidence, so I added it, and now we have the 8 steps for improving your immune system, which are exactly the 8 principles of health we were given at least since 1905 to improve our health. So the same 8 principles that help us to prevent chronic disease also help us to prevent infectious disease and improve our immune system so that we can fight those infectious diseases. Because just keep in mind that even with this coronavirus, about 80% of the people who get infected do not need to go to the hospital. They have either a mild infection or an asymptomatic infection where they don't even know they've had it. In other words, their immune system fights the disease and they're able to just recover all on their own. That's because their immune system worked. It's only 20% of the people who get infected who end up needing to go to the hospital because of difficulty breathing. And a smaller percentage of those need intensive care, and of those maybe some ventilators, and unfortunately some of them will die. But it is our immune system that makes the difference between those 2 groups. So I just find that amazing. I want to show you this article to finish off, and this was from the Los Angeles Times. It was printed a few years ago, 2015, and it says, why Loma Linda residents live longer than the rest of us? And then the answer is, they treat the body like a temple. So I hope this information has been helpful to you, and I hope you're able to share it with others so that other people may know the benefits of eating a whole food plant-based diet and of living a healthy lifestyle so they can live longer, healthier lives. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.